So in this lecture we're going to see that Russell uses this idea of being acquainted with something to argue for a particular semantic consequence. He's going to argue for a particular view of what most names mean on the basis of some theses about acquaintance. And just to remind you of something we talked about in the first day. So remember in the first day we talked about this distinction between semantics and metasemantics. So we said that the semantic question was something like, what is the meaning of a particular word? And we've been thinking about the semantic question for names. We've been asking, well, what do names mean? And we've seen the Millian answer to that question, we've seen the Lockean answer to that question, and we've seen the Fregean answer to that question. And we're going to be seeing a very different answer to it today. But we also talked about this other question, which is called the metasemantic question. But we also saw this other question, the metasemantic question. And the metasemantic question was roughly, well, in virtue of what does a particular name mean something? Or what are the conditions? What does it take for a name? Or what does it take for a word to have a particular kind of meaning? And one really important thing that Russell is doing in this paper is he's laying down a particular, what we might call a metasemantic principle. A metasemantic principle is a condition under which, in particular, names have meaning. He wants to say there's a particular condition of which an object has to meet in order for it to be the meaning of some name. And basically he's going to use this principle to argue against the Millian view. So let's start off by saying what that principle is. So here's the way that I'm going to formulate it, which is that if a word W refers to some object, then you must be acquainted with that object to know what W means. So for instance, the phrase David Boylan refers to me, Russell's saying, to know that that word refers to me, then you have to be acquainted with me. You have to be acquainted with me, the object the thing stands for, in order to know the meaning of the word. Russell doesn't give a lot of argument here. It's mainly just rests on a kind of intuition. And the intuition is that, well, clearly to know the meaning of a word, he thinks, you got to know what the thing is. How could you know the meaning of the word David Boylan if you didn't know who David Boylan is? Or how could you know the meaning of the word pangolin if you didn't know what a pangolin is? He thinks there's just a really tight connection between knowing what a word means and knowing what the thing it picks out is. But he thinks you only really know what an object is if you're directly acquainted with it. If you're not directly acquainted with it, then you don't know what it is. But if you put those two things together, of course, you get the idea that, well, you only know the meaning of a word, you only know what a word stands for, if you're directly acquainted with it. So the basic idea is, we have this metasemantic principle, which says you can only know the meaning of a word when you know what that object is. He thinks that to know what something is to be acquainted with it, or at least requires being acquainted with it. It's necessary for knowing what something is that you be acquainted with it. So you get the conclusion that if a word refers to an object, then you must be acquainted with that object. But we can see that this view has a pretty radical consequence. The consequence being that if that argument is right, then the Millian version of names just can't be correct. Because just take some of the examples of names that I started with. I talked about people like Mark Twain or Kanye West. Like, let's take the Kanye West example. I know what the meaning of the word Kanye West is. I'm perfectly capable of saying things about Kanye West or asking questions about Kanye West. My mastery of the meaning of the word is not in doubt. And yet, I'm not directly acquainted with him. That's something we established very early on. I've never met him. I probably never will meet him. So I can't be directly acquainted with him. But notice that on the argument that Russell just gave me, if all the word Kanye West meant was the person Kanye West, then I would have to not know what the meaning of the word is. Because I'm not acquainted with him. Russell thinks in order to know what something is, you have to be acquainted with him, so I don't know who he is. But in order to know the meaning of a word, I have to know who he is, and as we said, if I'm not acquainted with him, I don't know who he is. So it must be that if the Millian view were right, I wouldn't know the meaning of the name Kanye West. But that conclusion is absurd. I do know the meaning of the name Kanye West. So Russell would say, that must be the wrong view about meaning. It must be that, despite what it appeared, the meaning of the word Kanye West is not the object Kanye West. Again, it's worth relating this back to some of the things that I said on the very first day. Because I said, remember, the semantic question and the metasemantic question, these are different questions. The question, what does this particular word mean, is a different question from what would it take for the name to mean that thing. Or in virtue of what does the name mean that thing. And as I said in the beginning, there's a kind of dependence between these two sorts of questions. In particular, to really ask a metasemantic question, like to ask, like, why is it that the name Kanye West means Kanye West? That presupposes a particular answer to the semantic question, namely that the name Kanye West does mean Kanye West, so that it does stand for that particular person. And because there's this kind of dependence between these two questions, you can give an argument against a view of meaning by saying, well, there's no good answer to the metasemantic question. In fact, that's exactly what Russell is doing. He's saying, well, if the meaning of the word Kanye West was the person, then we would have to explain, like, why is it that the word is able to get that meaning? And he thinks we're not able to explain why the word gets that meaning, because people can know what the meaning of it is even when they're not acquainted with it. Even when, for that, he concludes, they don't know what the object is. They don't know who the person Kanye West is because they're not acquainted with him. So he thinks because there's no answer, there just can't be any good answer to the metasemantic question, it must be that our answer to the semantic question, that where we said the name Kanye West means the person Kanye West, something must have gone wrong there. Our answer to the semantic question must be wrong. So he's argued that because there's no good answer to the metasemantic question, our answer to the semantic question must be wrong. And that's an importantly different kind of argument from the ones that we've seen in previous weeks. In previous weeks, when we saw an argument against the Millian view, it was purely a semantic view. When Frege was arguing against the Millian view, the way he argued was that, well, if we just think about the meanings of sentences containing names, it seems like the Millian view gets us the wrong results. But that had nothing to do with this metasemantic question. So the argument that Russell has been giving us is very different from any of the arguments we've seen before against the Millian view. It's a metasemantic argument, not a semantic argument.